In this video, we'll take a look at how to check buff uptimes in ESO logs. So we'll go to the Buffs tab, and on the right-hand side here, we have Gained by Friendly, and we can either do this by looking at how often the buff was gained by a certain player, or how often it was cast by a player. So if we want to take a look at the healer's uptimes of combat prayer, we could do Cast by Friendly, and on the left-hand side here, we could change where it says All Abilities to the buff that is provided. You do not want to choose where it says Combat Prayer here, because that'll not show the actual buff that is being provided. As you can see, very low uptime, so that is not what we want. We'll scroll down here, down to Minor Berserk, the buff provided by Combat Prayer, and we chose the first one. That is not the correct one, because we do just see it is a Nightblade, so probably coming from Kinra's there, and choose the second one. Okay, so this will do. We could either do the instance of Minor Berserk in the menu here that has for both of our healers, so that would be obviously coming from Combat Prayer, or in this case, this is all sources of Minor Berserk. So we see our two healers, and player 17, our Templar healer, has 100% uptime, and that could be a little bit misleading because that just means it was up on at least one player for 100% of the fight. So if we click on their name, we can see their uptime, so how often they provided that buff to each player individually. So we see a few players over 80%. Since this is a for-all fight, we would expect that they'd be providing to about half the group, especially our damage dealers, so you'd want 4 damage dealers with some high uptimes. And we can see they have 1, 2, 3. These are our 2 tanks. And then our 4th player, so if this is on the same side that they're meant to be healing, only had 58% uptime. So either the healer wasn't pointing their heals correctly, or they might not have been refreshing it enough, or this player could have been out of position, or they were just receiving the buff from another source. So if it's being received from Kinra's, for example, and that buff is up for the duration of when the Combat Prayer Minor Berserk would have been up, it would not show as being received from this player 17. So it can be a little bit misleading there, showing that they aren't providing the buff, when in fact they may actually be casting the buff. Down here, we can choose Stacked, and that'll give us a visual representation. So higher is better. That means that it was up on more players at the same time. Lower means that it wasn't up on a lot of players. So we can see that at the lowest, it's up on about 4 players, and the highest looks like about 9 players. So they seem to be keeping the buff up quite a bit. We can go back to our Warden Healer here and select them and see how they did as well. And let's go on that stacked mode again. We can see that most of them had about 35% uptime at best, 63% on themselves. So at first glance, it seems like this healer wasn't providing the buff as much, but you do want to be cautious about that because it could just be, as I mentioned, that they're getting the buff from someone else. So maybe we have 3 Kinra's players on the side that the Warden Healer was healing, so it's looking like the Warden Healer is not keeping the buff up a lot. So in that case, you'd go to Gained by Friendly. We're going to deselect our player 5 Warden Healer here. And since we're already on the instance of Minor Berserk that's coming from all sources, we can just leave it as that. Otherwise, we would have to go through the menu again and find the source of Minor Berserk that is showing all sources. And here we can see that it was up 80% of the time on most players. There's a few players in the 70%, and then one player down here at 68%. So in that case, you'd maybe want to take a look at this. Maybe they were dead for that duration. Maybe they're doing mechanics, so this is for all. Maybe they were on the boat, and that's why they had a lower uptime. So you take a look at your roster, maybe see some of the reasons for that. And we can see that despite that one healer, our player 5 having low uptimes, looks like everybody had around the 80% uptime. You'd maybe want to double check if player 5 was the one healing these people in the 70%. Then you'd want to maybe consider that potentially this player 5 Warden Healer was not providing combat prayer enough to their side of the stack. And again, it could be the issues mentioned before about players out of position, healer not healing in the correct direction, and that way the buff is not being provided. And I'll show you how to check in another video positioning using the replay option, or how many times the skill was cast in the cast menu.